It had been less than a century since we first learned of this strange blue and green mud ball floating through the ether. We decided to investigate, and when we did, we found out that other races were trying to claim it for their own, but most were very passive. This is not the way we do things. We believed that we could simply take them over by force, but when we first looked at them, we realized that they could muster armies very quickly. Far too quickly. Even though our technology was well more advanced than theirs, they could simply bring so many pieces of machinery, so many of their own personnel, that we knew that we had to do something. So we waited. We waited until we were able to mass a force large enough. And while we did this, we used our own subterfuge to try and weaken the abilities within their planet. We followed their own social standards, and we began to break down their society through nefarious means. We started to give them chemical compositions that made them start acting strange. Not only that, but things that altered the way their own bodies reacted to certain stimuli, making it so that they would be more concerned with their own selves than with that of the planet or with that of their own creatures. Though some did not quite fall for this, and others went so far to the other side that it was comical to watch, we still continued our preparations. We believe now that it is the best time to advance. We believe now we could take their planet, and they will not be able to mass forces enough to stop us. Our battle plan cannot be defeated. This statement was given before the Grand Council before the invasion of the third planet of the Sol sector. This was the only obstacle they had, as this species only had one planet. They had not spread out even their own satellite, which they called Luna. They were simply stuck on that, as he said, blue and green mud ball. And with this, it would be an easy target. They believed that if they landed in one area and were easy to spread out, there was no way that what did they call them? Humans could mass forces enough to make their way towards their location and force them off. There's no way they could get enough ordnance there to punch through their own hulls. There's no way they could possibly ever get there. It would take too long to move the personnel and the equipment, and by then they would have such a strong hold on the surrounding area that the local population would just not be able to punch through. So the invasion went on as planned. For many people, it seemed to be part of the night as they came through the sky. Many of those that did see thought it was simply some sort of meteor shower or some site of space debris was starting to break up in the atmosphere as they came down. They had no idea what was coming, and the invasion was underway, and no one was the wiser. The invasion forces were not in particularly of a hurry to get set up, as landing on a new planet always has its own issues. They had to prepare themselves for potential biological issues. They knew that viruses, though eradicated around the universe, were prevalent on this planet. So they had to constantly be infusing themselves with different antiviral solutions, many of which would give them certain side effects. It was not common to see one of their kin stop all four of their legs and simply relieve themselves on the ground. Though disgusting and disturbing, it was not something to make fun of, as they knew that this was just a response. Others, simply instead of eradicating their bowels, would simply regurgitate right on their work, wipe the vomit off to the side, and then continue to keep going. They realized that this was a small price to pay, and the effects would only last for about 3 or 4 of their planetary rotations, what they called days. They believed at this point, as things were starting to wear off, they would be able to take care of these humans without much of an issue. Where they landed was covered in all sorts of poisonous creatures as well. They believed that this was the best place as it was wide open and easy to land all their forces. They believed the local population did not have the ability to get any of their forces inside fast enough. They worried, the invasion forces worried greatly about those sea-borne vessels. These things had a tendency to carry very large weapons that could reach a very long way, and they worried that possibly they would be struck by them if they got too close to a shoreline or landed inside the ocean. This left only one option: land where it was able to be set up, get their castle built as soon as possible, and then slowly, methodically work their way out, taking down each and every one of the settlements as they go. As they believed they could easily take down one of these locals without much problem, they continued to move. The invasion continued on schedule. Within one day, they saw a few different of the mechanical in-atmosphere fighters going across. Many of the invaders laughed as they realized that they could simply use their biomechanicals to fly just as high, maybe not as fast, but they could definitely maneuver much faster and much better using the organics to simply rotate in a way that they believed humans had not figured out yet. They simply chuckled to themselves, making many jokes as they continued to set up with slow and methodical precision. Within the end of the second day, many of them believed that it was enough time working to rest. They had been going for almost 2 human days at this point, so they believed that they had set up defenses enough. Their swarm was already on its way. This insectoid species knew that once they took the planet, the locals wouldn't know it, but they would soon be food, and their planet would be hollowed out to make a new hive. But to do this, you simply still had to pacify the local population. It was well noted that this species had certain devices, certain pieces of equipment that were dangerous to say the least. These nuclear devices that were called were more than enough to punch through the shields and simply melt down half of the castle with a single strike. However, that is not what they worried about. They worried more about the radiation that came off, as the only time they'd ever seen any of these devices used, they were very messy, spewing all sorts of radiation that once in the trade winds would go across the entire planet without any hesitation. So they simply rested. As they did, they believed they would wake up the next morning to an almost completely done castle and a almost completely conquered world. But what they woke up to would cause the survivors to never want to speak of it again. Alarms began to blare all over the place. They didn't know what was going on. They tried to figure out why all of a sudden they couldn't figure out what the hell was coming in. Their own sensors were having trouble locking onto things, but they kept blipping and blinking on that there was other things coming in. Certain things were seemingly coming in from nowhere. Were they running? Were they flying? Were they jumping? Mostly they could tell that they were flying, but there was even more. Around the entire area, more and more and more vehicles came in. How could they muster so many forces so fast? The local populations of this continent did not have the ability to transport this quick. How could they possibly get that many? They expanded their own sensor range and realized that there were many vessels coming towards their own island. This island, though they could secure it, was not big enough to defend, trying to get away from all those large guns. They believed they were just outside of the range and would find out very soon that there was something else that could reach farther than simple ballistic weapons. They watched, many of them with horror, as those that were ready to fight, the warriors, got their weapons and got ready for a straight-on assault. They believed the humans would charge at them en masse, and if they set up retreating pulse weapons, they could repel the humans. They could keep them back, as humans had a tendency to be afraid, watching one of their own break into many pieces. And with that, they lined up on the wall, waiting as the alarm still screamed. They didn't know what the hell was going on, and they went and looked closer to one of the vessels. But it wasn't one. It was many different vessels, many of them with different markings, waving different types of banners of different colors, all seemingly lined up in a line. It didn't make sense. I thought this was a separate species. Many of the command was trying desperately to try and figure out what was going on. This was completely separate from what they believed. They believed they could simply take this area. They believed humans were territorial, which they are, but not that territory. They believed they could take one territory, secure its resources, and simply go one territory at a time, taking one of the different races of humans at a time, one simple section, one simple island, one peninsula, one whatever it was at a time. But now they're looking at multiple ships lined up. Not only that, they looked on the docks and they could see that there was just hundreds and hundreds of other ships offloading a whole bunch of different humans. They tried to get their own weapon systems to line up, but the curvature of the planet didn't allow them to fire directly at them. Oh, great. Now what the hell do they do? They started to wish that they had never thrown away their old ballistic weapons so they could actually fire that close and they could just use the Coriolis effect to launch their weapons around and strike their target. But now, but now they were just glad that the humans didn't have those weapons. They didn't use those. Oh crap! What's happening? They saw in the sensors as many different flying vessels were in the air. Not only just the ones that they were trying to pick up, but hundreds, no, thousands were in the air, all of them coming from different areas, seemingly following a single one. Their scanners found one that was holding all sorts of different petroleum products, while others were simply burning through them. What the hell was going on? Why did they have different ones? But they looked the same on the radar. The three-dimensional layout showed them as simple cargo vessels. What the shit? They couldn't figure out what was going on. How was this possible? How could they bring everyone so quick? How could they come in such a... Oh no, is humanity insectoid? They started to converse with themselves. They tried to figure out, no, humans are mammalian. How could they come in such forces? Wait, I thought they didn't have as many people in their armed services anymore. They shouldn't have this many. And then they saw something they didn't expect. The cargo planes simply began to raise up, many of them, mostly in the first wave, raise up slowly at about a 10-degree angle. No, 20. Why so steep? And then they dropped something out. Large crates and pallets began to flow out, chasing some sort of parachute. It slowly moved, and then things started to bounce out of the parachute and outside the pallet, dropping one right after another, with 20 or 30 of these cargo vessels simply dropping them all over the place. They couldn't figure out what was going on, and now they had something flying. No, many somethings. Oh, hundreds of them. Hundreds. Is that thousands? No, it's even worse. The ships themselves began to fire all sorts of ordnance into the sky, which immediately began to arc towards their position. How in the ever-loving crap did they ever manage to do this? They couldn't figure out what was going on. They got their anti-air weapons ready to rock and roll, trying to lock on as many as possible. They decided they would take out the first wave. At least then they could have time to rearm, reload, and cool down their weapons before the next round hit. They saw that each one was just a layer after layer, having only about 1.5 minutes between each strike. They would have to fire at the first ones, the ones that seemingly were the easiest to lock onto. And then they fired all their ordnance into the air. Many of these interceptors were absolutely true on target and would lock on exactly perfect, hitting each of these strange bird-like creatures as they seemed to glide their way in, almost seemingly not having any type of engine output. They were how many kilometers away? 1,000? What the hell was going on? They couldn't figure it out. How were they able to do this? And then they saw something even worse as those missiles began to fly in closer. They looked down on their radar as one of their own spotters started screaming, Commander! Commander! So look at the... Something's wrong! They're using... They're using ordnance out that far! What are they doing? They looked and they saw many a soldier begin to lay down a small tube, setting it up at about a 45-degree angle, all of them with different types of data pads and then some sort of trigger in their hand? What the hell was that? Was that a clacker? What the heck was going on? And then, without a hesitation, they saw one simply raise their hand, and then all of a sudden, items were in the air. There was so much in the air now that they couldn't understand what was going on. They, a true insectoid species that was able to take over planets that were in their own medieval era without much of a problem just by showing up in significant numbers. And yet now this insectoid race was facing down a swarm of God knows what before they even knew what was going on. They looked, and with horror, even though the first wave of those that they had struck simply exploded, seemingly a very light explosive. This made them calm down a little bit, realizing that even though they could send a lot of ordnance, they did not have a lot of power behind them. It seemed as though they were using up almost the entire piece of ordnance flying in as some sort of rocket motor, meaning that their shields, their walls should hold, and should hold just fine if all they have to deal with is the kinetic impact from such small devices. But there was just so many of them. The swarm came in. Again, their anti-air fired, but they were having the hardest time locking on to some of these. It seemed as though the first ones were either older ordnance or they were, oh no. The command, as all their subordinates looked over, had all the color pull away from their eyes and their carapace, showing a sickly yellow, as they realized that the first wave was nothing but decoys. They had just blown through almost half of their ordnance, taking out decoys, and now they're still loading weapons as the first wave is about to hit. Everyone all of a sudden screamed, "Brace for impact!" as all sorts of chaos reigned. All the impacts shook against the walls, many of them only cracking the walls, other ones blowing clean through, some of them striking with enough force to blow entire buildings to pieces. Vehicles that were desperately trying to get away were seemingly locked onto as this ordnance kind of moved left and right and center and then dropped on. The large ordnance struck first, blowing extremely large holes in the walls and the side of the ships that had landed. They were desperate at that point. The command suddenly realized that if they took too much damage, they wouldn't be able to retreat. So they called for everyone to recall. You had 4 minutes to get back on the ships. They sent the recall order and the sirens went out. But as everyone ran on their 4 legs, they watched with horror as the second wave landed right on their ships, seemingly targeting the engine compartments specifically, ripping them open, and in one case, a massive burst coming out, blowing the entire ship into nothing but piles of molten slag. The burst of power that came out blew many of them off their feet, some blown literally to pieces, and anyone inside the ship was no more. The last 5 ships were there, still trying to spin up their engines, but they were still getting struck over and over and over again. They had no idea how in the ever-loving shit they were getting hit so hard by so much. They sent up their anti-air, but they still couldn't lock on everything. Most of them were not able to even find the ordnance that was hitting them before it struck, and now the next wave was striking them again. This one, though not hard to lock onto, they didn't have anything to hit them with, and now it was striking down with a vengeance. More and more of their ships were getting holes punched in them. More and more of them made it impossible to get outside of the atmosphere without killing everyone inside. One of them even tried to start its engines and took a missile straight into the aft section, blowing it open. Though the ship did not blow apart completely, it simply spun around, even though it was still placed on the ground, crashing into another ship. That was 3 of the 6 on the ground. They would not leave. 1, because it wasn't there anymore, and 2, because they had crashed into each other. The last 3 were desperately trying to go through final preparations as they watched as their own personnel were still running towards the ships, many of them not knowing where to go. The explosion from the first ship had concussed them so bad they seemingly didn't have any idea which direction to turn. And as they saw their own ships being punched through holes, they tried clamoring towards the ones that were still intact enough to get them out of there. And then they found something else. They heard something some sort of strange buzzing. It was almost as though one of their own flights must have come to save them. They looked up. Where's our flight? They've come to save us. They all started cheering and chittering into the air, waving their wings and their antennae as they reached towards the sky, and then they saw something small and black coming down towards them. What the hell was that? Was that a swarm? That could have been ours. Why are they diving? Why are they diving so fast? Why are they? Before they even had the chance to say, oh shit, it seemed like each of them was picking a target, moving its way left, right, and center, trying to figure out, line itself up, then suddenly dove down with an incredible amount of speed and striking and blowing up as soon as it hit. These kamikaze drones that came in just started blowing many of the foot soldiers apart, many of them losing limbs as each of them being struck. If it wasn't a direct hit, it was still enough force to blow them to pieces. If they were very lucky, they were struck in the head, and then there was no head. If not, if they were struck in the rear of the body, simply their abdomen and the reproductive systems would be blown clean off, leaving them to scream on the ground as they slowly bled out. Those that were there started screaming, many of them dropping down on all four knees, praying for some sort of deliverance. But if they held still, many of them were struck 2, 3, and 4 times by these same devices that came down. The swarm of all this came down with such force in the matter of just a few minutes that they did not have time to truly recover from anything. As they did, they realized there was even more problems. The one ship was still screaming an alert as it was still trying to run its engines up. They were trying to do some sort of damage control so they could get off this rock. They wanted to leave so badly. And here they thought the swarm of viruses were going to be bad. But no, now as they looked on their radar, many avian shaped devices were heading their way from all different directions, different shapes and sizes, many of them grouping in similar shapes. The silhouettes would line up, some of them only having one engine, some having two, and they just kept coming. And right behind them were more of those what seemed to be cargo planes that use a primitive drive, something to simply force air past them to keep them elevated into the sky. But now they were all speeding up, and soon the entire sky filled up with a swarm of these avian looking fixed wing fighters as they came down, strafing and firing all sorts of ordnance. Some of the ordnance dropping from their wings, others from their bellies, some of them appearing out of nowhere. Seemingly not able to lock on each of them, they got their short range weapons and simply fired up drastically, trying to blast anything they could. And they believed they had forced them back just enough. And then they believed that they could take to the skies as they realized it wouldn't be long until ground forces were there. They began to elevate up, and they looked and they believed again salvation had reached them as they saw out different fluttering of wings was coming across. They could hear in the distance, and they saw things moving like them, but it wasn't them. These things sounded like some sort of insectoid. They moved like an insectoid, but they had more weapons on them than you even wanted to know about. Suddenly, bursts of light came from the sides. Several of them fired entire pods with the ordnance that way, and before any of them realized what was going on, another swarm of ordnance was coming in, blasting through them. Many of them shot clean out of the sky, many of them not quite dead yet as they plummeted down to their doom. Others blown absolutely to pieces, and when it seemed like they had run out of ordnance to throw at the invading forces, they came in and began using direct fire ballistic weapons, firing from just outside of their own pulse weapon range. These ballistic weapons would tear through them even worse. They were begging for mercy, many of them screaming the final captain to just either take off or call a surrender. Anything they wanted to any way to survive. And that's when it happened. They realized that those cargo planes that were coming had not fired like the other ones did. They did not drop ordnance, and yet they came almost directly over top. seemingly splitting in two directions. But the two different groups that came in were all of a sudden seemingly going on the outskirts of their base, and then something was falling out of them. Something that opened into a strange mushroom shape 2, 3, 4, 12, 18, so many that they couldn't keep up. These were not being seen on their own radar as if they had anything left to shoot at them. But what was coming down? What was coming down, floating softly, was a swarm of. Are they insane? Humanity is using the air. Humanity, a species without wings, is now using the air to bring their own people in. And as they looked on the last remaining radar, they could see that so many vehicles were beginning to move into their area, and then screaming alarms as another round of those crazy kamikaze drones were heading their way. But some of them were much, much larger. Many of the invading forces at that point simply dropped their weapons, raised any appendages they still had in a show of submission and a way to please let them survive. With this, the short-range weapons on the last remaining operational ship began to fire into their own, calling them cowards, as they began to fire down on surrendering forces. With that, they could see that the humans were touching down, grabbing their weapons, and coming in with such proficiency it was absolutely horrible. Some of them reaching over to another weapon system they were setting up, and then suddenly they saw them launch more ballistic weapons over towards them. But these, like old school ballistic weapons, would jump over the edge of what remained and were landing on the remaining ship. It powered up, most likely in a vain attempt to leave, saying, "Fuck it, everyone else can die." But as it began to go up, the fixed-wing aircraft came back. And when they came back, they began to fire as much as they could into that ship coming out. And one lucky shot ended up right inside the cockpit. But then again, it wasn't lucky, as almost every single one of their ordnance seemed to be locked on. The swarm of missiles had simply torn the cockpit to pieces, and the ship itself violently spun out of control and crashed into the outback. Now, they were there, surrounded by a swarm of humans, with a swarm of other humans in the sky, and a swarm of ordnance coming in. The invaders would look at each other, screech to the heavens that they swore they would never return if they were allowed to live. One of the ships was not able to take off, but took this recording. This was the last they saw as the humans came in. Those that could still fight of the insectoid race were fighting back, but being torn to pieces by ballistic weapons with sheer unadulterated efficiency as they came up close with their weapons raised. As soon as they saw them, they would blow off limbs, heads, abdomens, it didn't matter, punch holes right through the carapace and didn't even slow down. They just kept moving forward. It is now noted that the insectoid race will leave this mudball alone as they fear it. They fear what would happen if they sent another invasion force. Plans are being made. Perhaps they can simply cordon off the entire planet. Maybe they could simply drop the moon on it. Maybe they could do something to stop the swarm. As to stop a swarm, you need something drastic. While they spoke, deep in space, in a sector that no one in the galactic community seems to care about, a species begins to dissect not only those that came to see what they're actually made of, but dissect their technology and have made plans. They have made plans that they will no longer sit by on their rock and wait for someone to attack. They will bring the swarm into space, and they will stop any who dare threaten them. And the few species that have small monitoring on this mudball always say the same thing. When they speak of humanity, it may be a little misleading, but the phrase is, "Fear the swarm."